It started with a story the world believed without question. A tale so intimate, so heartbreaking, that millions of people felt as if they were sharing Meghan Markle's grief. The story of a miscarriage in July 2020, revealed through a deeply personal New York Times op-ed in November of the same year, was supposed to be a testament to resilience, to the pain of loss, and to the courage of speaking out. And yet, behind the carefully chosen words and the tear-stained narrative, there lingered a question few dared to ask aloud. Was everything Meghan said true? Or was there more to the story, something darker, more complicated, something only her mother, Doria Ragland, truly understood? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the very first paragraph, Meghan's op-ed captured the world's attention. It was powerful, raw, and emotionally charged. The New York Times, a platform known for rigor and gravitas, lent credibility to her words. People across the globe empathized with her loss. Comments poured in. Social media erupted. Headlines read like eulogies for a grief we collectively shared. But while the public grieved alongside her, inside the royal family, and in the private world of Meghan's closest confidants, there was unease. Questions whispered behind closed doors. Glances exchanged in silence. And most significantly, one person watched, listened, and waited. One person had knowledge that could shatter the narrative that had captivated a planet. Doria Ragland, Meghan's mother. For years, Doria had been the quiet force behind her daughter. A figure of support, of patience, of dignity. She had lived her life largely outside the spotlight, avoiding media scrutiny, choosing privacy over publicity. But her silence did not mean ignorance. Doria knew her daughter intimately. She knew her strengths, her vulnerabilities, and the layers of complexity that the world often ignored. And she had observed the unfolding of Meghan's story from a distance, noting contradictions, inconsistencies, and, perhaps most importantly, truths left unspoken. In the world of the royal family, truth and narrative are often separate entities, but Doria Ragland had always valued honesty above spectacle. And now, finally, she had broken her silence. Imagine the tension of watching a story unfold about someone you love, someone you've raised, nurtured, protected, and realizing that the world believes a version of events that doesn't fully align with the truth you know. That is the position Doria found herself in when Meghan went public with her miscarriage. It was a story that would forever define her daughter's public image, but it was also a story that had consequences that rippled far beyond personal grief. And yet, the timing of the op-ed raises questions that few have explored. July 2020, a year unlike any other, filled with uncertainty, isolation, and global upheaval due to a pandemic. Within this context, Meghan's announcement was powerful, raw, and highly visible. It tapped into the collective emotional consciousness of a world desperate for personal connection amid crisis. But as powerful as the story was, the op-ed was more than just a personal revelation. It was a strategic narrative, carefully constructed to shape public perception. The words were precise, deliberate, and, some argue, intentionally positioned to generate empathy, solidarity, and support. Yet behind those words, according to sources close to Doria Ragland, there was a gap between perception and reality, a gap that the public had not been invited to examine. This is why Doria's perspective matters now more than ever. She is not just Meghan's mother. She is an observer of the entire arc of the story, from childhood, through fame, through the royal ascension, and ultimately to public scrutiny. Her voice carries authority precisely because she has been there from the beginning. And unlike the narrative presented in the media, Doria's account is unfiltered, unmediated, and deeply personal. For the first time, she is speaking openly, revealing the truths she has held close for years, truths that contradict what the public has been led to believe. And these revelations are not merely eyebrow-raising. They are potentially world-altering. In terms of how we perceive Meghan Markle, her choices, and the way she has presented herself to the world. You might be wondering, why now? Why would Doria Ragland, a woman known for her discretion and her measured public appearances, suddenly choose to speak out? The answer is complex. It is a combination of frustration, loyalty, and moral imperative. Years of seeing her daughter's story manipulated, misunderstood, or selectively edited by media outlets, and even by Meghan herself reached a tipping point. Doria's decision to break her silence was not impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and intended to reveal a perspective that had been missing from the global conversation. And in doing so, she has opened a Pandora's box of revelations that will challenge everything the public has accepted as truth. But before we delve into Doria Ragland's statements, it's essential to understand the stakes. Meghan Markle is not just any public figure. She is a former actress, a duchess, a woman whose life has been scrutinized under the relentless gaze of the global media. Every decision she makes, every word she writes, every photograph she releases is analyzed, dissected, and broadcast to millions. In this environment, truth is malleable, and perception is everything. The narrative she constructs, especially about personal trauma, becomes part of a larger story that influences public opinion, philanthropic support, and even the legacy of the royal family itself. A single claim, such as the miscarriage, carries weight far beyond its personal dimension. It becomes a symbol, a talking point, and, in some cases, a tool for shaping perception. So, what did Doria Ragland observe? What truths did she witness that contradict the story the world consumed with tears in their eyes? According to insiders, her revelations are nuanced, emotionally charged, and, at times, devastating. They reveal contradictions, inconsistencies, and strategic choices in Meghan's public statements. They also reveal the tension between personal grief and public narrative, between what is lived in private and what is presented on the global stage. And the most startling part is that these revelations come not from an outsider, a journalist, or a critic, but from someone who knows Meghan more intimately than anyone else, her mother. As we explore this story, one question will guide our journey. How does truth survive when it is filtered through fame, ambition, and public scrutiny? How does a family navigate love, loyalty, and integrity when their private lives become global spectacle? These are not just questions about Meghan Markle. They are universal questions about the tension between private reality and public persona. And Doria Ragland's account forces us to confront these questions in the most dramatic, unflinching way possible. The stakes are higher than ever. The world believes one story. The family knows another. And the truth, as Doria Ragland reveals, is more complex, more painful, and more shocking than most people ever imagined. It is a story of love and betrayal, of protection and revelation, of grief and strategy. It is a story that challenges the narratives we have long accepted and demands that we reconsider our assumptions. And the timing could not be more critical. With Meghan Markle's public image under scrutiny, with the media circling like predators, and with fans and critics alike waiting for the next development, Doria Ragland's voice has arrived at a moment when it can no longer be ignored. So, as we begin to unpack the revelations of Doria Ragland, ask yourself this. How much of what you thought you knew about Meghan Markle is real? How much is curated, crafted, and designed to shape perception? And most importantly, what happens when the one person who truly knows the answer finally speaks? The answer is coming, and it will change everything you thought you understood about this story, this family, and this woman who captivated the world. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Everyone thinks they know Meghan Markle. Actress turned duchess, feminist icon, global celebrity, wife of Prince Harry. She has been photographed in designer gowns, photographed holding her children, photographed smiling for the cameras, always composed, always polished. But the public image, the one meticulously curated through photos, interviews, and press releases, tells only part of the story. There is the Meghan we see, and there is the Meghan only a few, like her mother Doria Ragland, truly know. And between the two versions lies a tension that has fascinated, frustrated, and shocked the world for years. Consider the narrative that has been presented. Meghan as the modern fairy tale princess, independent yet glamorous, philanthropic yet approachable. She speaks openly about injustice, about the struggles she has faced, and about the importance of being heard. She writes personal essays that tug at the heartstrings. She gives interviews that feel intimate, almost confessional, and the public responds in kind. Millions connect to her story. Millions believe it. But what if the story has gaps? What if those gaps were more than omissions? What if they were deliberate, curated, or strategically framed. Doria Ragland, Meghan's mother, has watched this duality for decades. From Meghan's early days in Los Angeles to her rise in Hollywood, and eventually to her entrance into the British royal family, Doria observed both the charm and the calculation. She saw the daughter the world adored, but she also saw the moments no one else did, the private doubts, the insecurities, the anger and frustration that Meghan rarely let slip in public. And now, after years of observing, Doria is finally speaking about the Meghan behind the headlines. The one the world thinks they know versus the one she truly is. The tension between perception and reality became particularly pronounced during Meghan's engagement and subsequent marriage to Prince Harry. Publicly, she was the perfect match, a bridge between Hollywood and royalty, progressive yet traditional, charismatic yet humble. But insiders have long noted the subtle discrepancies between the image portrayed in the media and Meghan's actual behavior behind the scenes. Doria, more than anyone, noticed these inconsistencies. She watched as her daughter navigated palace protocols and media scrutiny, sometimes bending her personality to fit expectations, sometimes challenging them outright. Doria's perspective is critical because she sees both sides. The Meghan who adapts for public consumption and the Meghan who exists privately, away from cameras and headlines. This duality is not uncommon for public figures, of course. Celebrities craft images, carefully presenting what they want the world to see while keeping personal vulnerabilities hidden. But in Meghan's case, the stakes were higher. Royalty is not just about public image. It is about legacy, tradition, and perception. One misstep can ripple across continents, affecting public opinion, media narratives, and even historical records. Doria understood this. She understood that every action, every word, every statement her daughter made would be scrutinized endlessly. And she also understood that Meghan's private truth, the full, unfiltered reality, might never align with the story the public was being fed. The miscarriage narrative of July 2020 exemplifies this duality perfectly. Publicly, Meghan presented herself as vulnerable, grieving, and courageous. Her New York Times op-ed portrayed a raw, emotional journey of loss that resonated with millions. People sympathized, empathized, and connected with her pain. But according to sources close to Doria, there were nuances in that story, details, timelines, and context that were not included or were presented in ways that shaped perception rather than truth. Doria had knowledge of these subtleties. She had seen the private moments of her daughter's life, the conversations, the private struggles, the moments of doubt, and she understood how they contrasted with the public narrative. So why does this matter now? Because Doria's revelations have the power to shift the way the world sees Meghan Markle. They do not merely add color to the story. They challenge the very foundation of the narrative that has been built over years. Doria is uniquely positioned to comment because she is not motivated by public acclaim or media attention. She has always valued privacy and integrity. When she chooses to speak, it is not for sensationalism. It is to present a perspective grounded in truth, family experience, and personal insight. And in doing so, she exposes the cracks, the inconsistencies, and the hidden dynamics that the public rarely, if ever, sees. One example of this duality lies in the way Meghan handles public messaging. In interviews, she presents herself as completely honest, transparent, and self-aware. But behind the cameras, sources say, there is a strategic mind carefully calculating how each statement will be received, how it will shape the media narrative, and how it will influence public perception. Doria has observed this firsthand. She has seen her daughter craft stories, choose details selectively, and present her life in ways that amplify certain emotions while minimizing others. The difference between the Meghan the public consumes and the Meghan known intimately by her mother is not always dramatic, but it is significant enough to change how one interprets events, especially emotionally charged ones like the miscarriage narrative. Consider also Meghan's interactions with friends, family, and royal staff. Public appearances show charm, warmth, and approachability. Private interactions reveal complexity, moments of tension, frustration, or strategic calculation. These are not flaws. They are human reactions to pressure and scrutiny. But when only one side is shown publicly, the perception becomes skewed. Doria, in her observations, has seen how these moments of private complexity are transformed, or sometimes ignored, when the story reaches the media. The public receives a polished version, while the truth remains obscured. This contrast is central to understanding why Doria's voice is so important. She bridges the gap between perception and reality, offering insights that few others could provide. And yet, even as we examine these contradictions, it is essential to acknowledge Meghan's strengths. Her charisma, intelligence, and determination are undeniable. She has used her platform to advocate for causes, speak out against injustice, and navigate one of the most scrutinized lives in the world. Doria recognizes these qualities and celebrates them. But admiration does not equate to unquestioning acceptance of every public claim. That is where the tension lies, between love for her daughter and commitment to truth. Doria's account is not a condemnation. It is a reflection of a mother's desire to ensure that the public understands the full picture, not just the curated version. So as we begin to explore this story, we must keep one question in mind. What does it mean when the story the world believes is only part of the truth? How does that partial story shape perception, influence empathy, and define legacy? And most importantly, what happens when the one person who knows the full story decides to speak? Doria Ragland's decision to break her silence is a turning point, one that has the potential to reshape not only how we see Meghan Markle, but also how we understand the interplay between personal experience and public narrative. The stakes are enormous. The revelations could influence public opinion, media coverage, and the historical record. They could challenge long-held assumptions and force reconsideration of events that seemed straightforward. And they are not just about Meghan's miscarriage. They are about the broader dynamics of family, loyalty, ambition, and perception. Doria's perspective illuminates the shadows of these dynamics, providing context and depth that the public has never before been privy to. And now, as Doria finally speaks, the world is listening, and the implications are profound. What she reveals next will not merely add to the story, it will change it. And those who thought they understood Meghan Markle will be forced to confront a version of events that is both startling and illuminating. But what comes next is even more compelling. The story of July 2020, the miscarriage that shook the world, and the version of events that Doria has witnessed behind the scenes. A story that millions believed, but that, according to Doria, may not have been entirely as it seemed. The truth, as she tells it, is about to surface, and it will change everything we thought we knew about Meghan Markle. July 2020, a month that, for many, passed quietly amid the chaos of a global pandemic. But for Meghan Markle, it became a moment that would forever define her public narrative, a personal tragedy thrust into the global spotlight. The story of her miscarriage was intimate, devastating, and, at first glance, entirely relatable. Millions across the world felt the grief with her. Social media filled with messages of support, news outlets reported the tragedy with solemnity, and headlines framed Meghan as both vulnerable and courageous. And yet, behind the public story, there were whispers, subtle, almost imperceptible, that not everything may have been exactly as it seemed. The announcement of a miscarriage is never easy. It is deeply personal, profoundly painful, and often accompanied by feelings of isolation and sorrow. For Meghan, that grief became public almost immediately. Unlike many who mourn privately, she chose to share her experience with the world through a highly visible platform. A New York Times op-ed published 4 months later, in November 2020. The op-ed painted a harrowing picture of loss and emotional devastation. She spoke of heartbreak, of trauma, and of the struggle to find hope amid unimaginable sorrow. The narrative was raw, intimate, and meticulously crafted to elicit empathy. The op-ed opened with vulnerability. Meghan described her experience in detail, offering glimpses into the physical and emotional toll of miscarriage. She spoke of loss that is profound, of feeling isolated and alone even within the support of family and friends, and of the struggle to process grief in a world that rarely stops to pause. It was compelling, relatable, and emotionally devastating. For many readers, it felt like they were sitting beside her, sharing her heartbreak in real time. The power of her words lay not just in the story itself, but in the way it was framed. Personal yet universal, specific yet symbolic. It was a narrative designed to resonate, and it succeeded. But Doria Ragland, Meghan's mother, watched the unfolding story with a different perspective. While the world mourned alongside her daughter, Doria observed nuances, timelines, and private interactions that were never shared publicly. In Doria's view, the op-ed, while powerful, was not entirely reflective of the full circumstances of July 2020. According to sources close to Doria, there were contradictions between Meghan's private recounting of events and the version presented to the public. These discrepancies were subtle, often lost amid the emotional weight of the story, but they mattered immensely. One of the most striking aspects of Doria's observations was the timeline of events. She noted that certain medical details, timing, and the nature of the miscarriage were not fully aligned with what had been reported. While the public assumed a straightforward narrative, Doria saw moments of uncertainty, confusion, and ambiguity that were never conveyed. This is not to say that the miscarriage did not occur. Miscarriage is a real and painful experience. But rather that the way it was presented and the surrounding context differed from the lived reality that Doria had witnessed. The distinction is critical because it highlights the gap between public perception and private truth, a gap that Doria has now chosen to illuminate. The emotional dimension of July 2020 was equally complex. Meghan was grieving, yes, but she was also navigating unprecedented public scrutiny. Every detail of her life was under examination. Every word she uttered, every photograph she shared, every interview she gave was analyzed for hidden meaning. The pressure to maintain composure, to present a narrative that was both authentic and sympathetic, was immense. Doria observed this struggle firsthand. She saw her daughter oscillate between vulnerability and strategic presentation, between private sorrow and public poise. It was a balancing act few could fully appreciate, and even fewer could critique without being accused of insensitivity. Yet, according to Doria, these dynamics shaped the way the miscarriage story was ultimately told. The op-ed, while emotionally compelling, reflected not only grief, but also careful consideration of public impact. Each word, each phrase, was chosen to resonate with readers, to create empathy, to craft a narrative that would frame Meghan as both relatable and heroic. From Doria's perspective, this is where the story diverges from lived reality. The private experience of July 2020 included nuances, hesitations, and complexities that were not fully conveyed in the public account. Consider the emotional aftermath. A miscarriage, even under private circumstances, leaves lingering grief and trauma. For someone living under constant public scrutiny, that grief is magnified exponentially. Doria witnessed her daughter struggle not only with loss, but with the weight of expectation, media attention, and public interpretation. Meghan had to process not only her personal grief, but also the symbolic grief of the world watching, empathizing, and judging. It is this dual burden that, according to Doria, made July 2020 not just a personal tragedy, but a complex social and emotional event, one that could not be fully captured in any public essay or statement. Another dimension was the role of support systems. Within the royal household, there were conflicting pressures and advice. Friends and family outside the palace offered empathy and privacy. Insiders within the royal institution encouraged discretion, decorum, and image management. Doria, as a mother, saw the tensions that arose when personal grief intersected with institutional expectations. She saw moments where Meghan's private pain clashed with the public role she was expected to maintain. And she saw how these moments, when filtered through media coverage and selective storytelling, could be misinterpreted or oversimplified. What makes July 2020 particularly significant, beyond the miscarriage itself, is the way it became a defining moment in Meghan's public narrative. The world interpreted it as evidence of courage, resilience, and authenticity. It painted a portrait of a duchess who was willing to expose her most intimate vulnerability for the sake of connection, empathy, and advocacy. And in many ways, it was all of these things. But, from Doria's vantage point, it was also a story with omissions and emphasis choices that shaped perception in a specific way. In short, the public story was compelling, but it was not the full story. Doria's decision to break her silence is revolutionary precisely because it challenges this partial narrative. By providing insight into the behind-the-scenes reality of July 2020, she allows the public to see the complexities, contradictions, and emotional layers that were previously invisible. She is not denying Meghan's pain. She is contextualizing it, offering a fuller understanding of the circumstances and highlighting the difference between public storytelling and private truth. This distinction is crucial because it reframes how we interpret Meghan's words, her op-ed, and her public persona. Finally, it is important to understand why Doria's perspective matters not just for historical accuracy, but for emotional and social impact. The miscarriage narrative shaped public empathy, influenced perceptions of the royal family, and contributed to the global discourse on grief, vulnerability, and female agency. By adding her voice, Doria is not only correcting potential misconceptions, but also expanding the conversation. She reminds the world that every public story has a private counterpart, that every carefully crafted narrative carries omissions, and that the truth of human experience is often more complex than headlines suggest. As we move forward, the question that lingers is this: how will the world respond to Doria's revelations? How will they affect the perception of Meghan Markle, the royal family, and the media that amplified the story? And perhaps most importantly, how will they reshape our understanding of July 2020, the month that millions around the world mourned alongside Meghan, believing the story as it was presented? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The full layers of July 2020, as witnessed and described by Doria Ragland, reveal not only personal grief, but a narrative carefully constructed for public consumption, a story that would have consequences far beyond the initial heartbreak. The New York Times op-ed, published in November 2020, was a seismic moment, not just in Meghan Markle's life, but in the global narrative surrounding her, Prince Harry, and the royal family. When Meghan's words appeared on that prestigious platform, they were immediately framed as brave, raw, and revelatory. Millions read her story, felt her grief, and, for a time, the world seemed united in empathy. But what most readers didn't realize was that the op-ed was more than just a personal account. It was a carefully constructed narrative designed to elicit specific emotions and shape public perception in a way that served multiple purposes. The opening lines of the op-ed immediately draw readers into Meghan's world. She begins with the experience of loss, the emptiness, the shock, and the physical and emotional toll of miscarriage. The language is vivid, intimate, and meticulously chosen. Phrases like "my heart shattered," "the emptiness that followed," and "the silence that only grief can create" were not accidental. They were selected to create a shared emotional space where readers could feel her pain as though it were their own. It is a masterclass in storytelling, one that mixes vulnerability with authority, personal sorrow with universal relatability. Yet, according to Doria Ragland, this opening also exemplifies the careful shaping of narrative. While the grief was undoubtedly real, the timing, emphasis, and omission of certain details subtly reframed the story for maximum public impact. Doria observed, for example, how the public framing omitted complexities and nuances that were critical to understanding the full picture of July 2020. Certain private conversations, the timing of medical consultations, and emotional responses that did not align neatly with the narrative of heartbreak were excluded. The result was a story that felt entirely authentic but, in Doria's eyes, was incomplete. The op-ed's central theme is resilience through loss, but it is also a statement of agency. Meghan positions herself as a woman who has endured profound pain, yet continues to speak out, to advocate, and to lead. The rhetorical strategy is powerful. It humanizes her while simultaneously elevating her moral authority. By sharing a deeply personal tragedy, she invites readers into her inner world while reinforcing her public persona as courageous, self-aware, and socially conscious. Doria, while supportive of her daughter's strength, notes that the op-ed also served as a strategic intervention, a way to control the narrative, to frame the public perception, and to assert agency over a story that was already being interpreted by countless media outlets and social commentators. One of the most striking aspects of the op-ed, as observed by Doria, is the balance between emotional vulnerability and narrative control. Meghan writes with raw honesty, yet every paragraph is structured with precision. Emotional peaks are punctuated by reflection, grief is tempered by insight, and personal sorrow is framed within a broader social context. This structure is what makes the essay compelling, but it also raises questions about selective storytelling. According to Doria, certain private realities were simplified or omitted entirely to create a narrative arc that would resonate with the public, rather than reflect the messy, multifaceted truth of the experience. The op-ed also serves as a commentary on the role of public expectation and scrutiny. Meghan highlights the pressure to maintain composure, the isolation that comes with grief, and the challenges of processing personal trauma under a global microscope. For Doria, these observations were accurate but incomplete. The private reality, as she saw it, included moments of frustration, anger, and even fear, emotions that were smoothed over in the essay to present a more cohesive, digestible narrative for public consumption. This is not to say the op-ed was false. Rather, it was curated, shaped for impact, and carefully positioned to shape the reader's perception of both Meghan and the royal family. Another critical element of the op-ed is its broader societal resonance. Meghan connects her personal loss to universal experiences, framing miscarriage as a shared trauma that touches millions. She writes about grief in ways that transcend social class, nationality, and fame, inviting readers to see themselves in her story. This is one of the reasons the essay was so widely praised. It transformed private sorrow into a public conversation about empathy, loss, and resilience. Yet, from Doria's perspective, the universality of the message also obscured certain personal truths, smoothing over details that could complicate the narrative or challenge the desired emotional impact. The op-ed's reception was as intense as the essay itself. Headlines praised Meghan's courage, social media erupted with support, and commentators lauded the vulnerability displayed in her writing. For a moment, the world collectively mourned with her. But the very visibility that amplified her story also magnified scrutiny. Every sentence was dissected, every word analyzed for hidden meaning, and every omission speculated upon. And in this context, Doria's later commentary provides crucial insight. She confirms that while the public responded to the essay with empathy, the private reality included layers of complexity that the op-ed did not capture. Doria also notes the timing of the op-ed as significant. Publishing the essay 4 months after the miscarriage allowed the story to be carefully framed, edited, and positioned for maximum impact. It also allowed Meghan to gauge public perception and craft her narrative in a controlled environment. From a strategic standpoint, this delay was critical. It transformed a deeply personal event into a public statement with far-reaching implications for reputation, empathy, and influence. According to insiders, this is where Doria's concern emerged. The op-ed was not merely a story of grief. It was also a carefully managed narrative that shaped how the world perceived Meghan, the royal family, and even the institution itself. Finally, the op-ed highlights a tension central to Meghan's public life: the interplay between personal experience and public narrative. The essay presents grief in a way that feels raw, authentic, and relatable. But, as Doria later reveals, it is only one layer of the story. The private experience included uncertainties, moments of doubt, and emotional reactions that did not fit neatly into the essay's narrative arc. By understanding this tension, we gain insight into the challenges Meghan faced: the need to communicate vulnerability while maintaining control, the struggle to honor private reality while appealing to public empathy, and the balancing act between personal truth and public storytelling. As we move forward, it becomes clear that the New York Times op-ed was more than a personal essay. It was a turning point in Meghan's public narrative. It shaped perceptions, framed public empathy, and positioned her in a specific way on the global stage. But, as Doria Ragland reveals, it was also a narrative constructed with precision, omitting key nuances and simplifying the complexities of July 2020 for public consumption. This distinction between public story and private reality is central to understanding the revelations Doria would later provide. And what Doria reveals next is even more compelling. The behind-the-scenes perspective of July 2020, the private moments of grief, frustration, and strategic calculation that existed alongside the public narrative, and the contradictions that would later come to define the story of Meghan Markle's miscarriage. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. For years, Doria Ragland remained largely invisible to the public eye. She was the mother of Meghan Markle, yes, but she was also a woman of quiet strength, discretion, and principle. While the world focused on her daughter's rise, from Hollywood actress to global celebrity to Duchess of Sussex, Doria stayed in the background, choosing observation over commentary, support over spectacle. She was always present, always watching, but never drawing attention to herself. In many ways, she was the silent observer, the calm eye in the storm of public scrutiny surrounding her daughter. Doria's life before Meghan's entrance into the royal spotlight was one of stability, education, and community. She is known for her work in social services, her dedication to yoga and mindfulness, and her role as a supportive mother. Unlike the high-profile figures she now surrounds, Doria lived deliberately away from media attention. She valued privacy, integrity, and authenticity, qualities that would later make her observations of Meghan's life both insightful and uniquely credible. While Meghan navigated Hollywood and then the royal spotlight, Doria's focus was on grounding her daughter in reality, offering perspective, and maintaining the principles that had guided their family for decades. It is this foundation that makes Doria's voice so compelling. She was not a casual observer, nor a critic writing from afar. She was intimately involved in Meghan's upbringing, instilling values of empathy, independence, and personal responsibility. She watched her daughter grow into a confident, ambitious woman, capable of commanding attention, inspiring admiration, and navigating complex social dynamics. And yet, despite Meghan's public success, Doria maintained an understanding of the nuances that fame often obscures, the pressures, insecurities, and contradictions that accompany public life. When Meghan's life became intertwined with the British royal family, Doria's role shifted subtly but significantly. She became a guardian of truth, a touchstone of reality, and an observer of dynamics that few outsiders could fully comprehend. While the world saw Meghan attending glamorous events, making public statements, and enduring constant media scrutiny, Doria saw the private moments that the cameras never captured. The anxiety before public appearances, the private conversations about strategy and perception, and the emotional toll of living under constant surveillance. She witnessed both her daughter's triumphs and her moments of vulnerability, giving her insight that no journalist, biographer, or casual observer could ever attain. Doria's silence in the public sphere was deliberate. She understood the stakes. Speaking prematurely or without careful consideration could not only disrupt Meghan's carefully managed narrative, but could also provoke backlash from the royal establishment and the media. She remained silent because she valued discretion, because she respected her daughter's autonomy, and because she understood the delicate balance of loyalty and truth. Yet her silence was never passive. It was a conscious choice, an act of observation and careful reflection. She absorbed the details, noted the contradictions, and prepared for a moment when speaking would be both necessary and impactful. That moment came in the aftermath of Meghan's miscarriage op-ed and the ensuing media frenzy. For Doria, it was not a matter of disputing her daughter's pain. She fully recognized the reality of loss and the emotional toll it exacted. But she also recognized that the narrative presented to the public was incomplete, strategically framed, and lacking critical context. There were omissions, nuances, and private realities that had never been shared. These gaps mattered because they shaped public perception, influenced media narratives, and affected how Meghan's actions and statements were interpreted. Doria's perspective, grounded in intimate knowledge, offered a corrective lens through which to view the events of 2020. Her observations extended beyond the miscarriage narrative. Doria watched the media coverage of Meghan's public life, the way headlines amplified certain actions, downplayed others, and constructed a story that often favored drama over accuracy. She noticed the contradictions between Meghan's public statements and private behavior. She observed the ways in which public perception could diverge dramatically from lived reality. And she understood the stakes of remaining silent versus speaking out. Every word she would eventually share was measured, deliberate, and intended to illuminate the truth without causing unnecessary harm. Doria's role as observer also provided her with a unique vantage point on family dynamics. She saw the interactions between Meghan and other members of the royal family, noting both moments of connection and tension. She witnessed the influence of advisors, friends, and allies, and she understood how these dynamics shaped Meghan's decisions and public statements. This perspective is critical because it situates her revelations not as gossip or conjecture, but as informed, first-hand insight. Doria did not speculate. She reported what she observed, providing clarity on situations that had been distorted, simplified, or misunderstood by the media. The power of Doria's silence cannot be overstated. By remaining in the background, she cultivated authority and credibility. When she chose to speak, her words carried weight precisely because they were not impulsive, reactive, or performative. They were the culmination of years of observation, reflection, and intimate knowledge. The world had seen Meghan through media lenses, social media snapshots, and public appearances, but Doria saw her without filters. She understood the emotional realities behind every photograph, every interview, every statement. This perspective is what makes her account uniquely valuable and, at times, shocking. Perhaps most importantly, Doria's observations highlight the tension between love and truth. She loves her daughter unconditionally, but she also values honesty and integrity. Speaking out about discrepancies or inconsistencies in Meghan's public narrative was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of responsibility. It was an effort to ensure that the truth, complex, messy, and human, was not entirely obscured by the curated image presented to the world. Doria's dual commitment to love and truth sets the stage for the revelations that follow, providing context, credibility, and emotional weight to the story she is now sharing. In many ways, Doria Ragland represents the conscience of the narrative. She observes, reflects, and waits for the right moment to speak. Her role as silent observer is not passive. It is strategic, deliberate, and deeply informed. And as the events of 2020 and beyond unfold, her perspective becomes increasingly critical. It allows the public to see the nuances, contradictions, and complexities that were previously invisible. It reveals a dimension of Meghan Markle's life that is rarely acknowledged but profoundly significant. As we prepare to delve into the first cracks in Meghan's public story, the moments where perception and reality diverged, it is essential to understand the foundation Doria provides. She is not a distant commentator or a sensationalist source. She is a witness, a mother, and a keeper of private truths. Her observations illuminate the subtleties of family dynamics, the pressures of public life, and the strategic nature of narrative construction. And, most importantly, her voice is about to reveal the first pieces of a story that challenges everything the public has believed about Meghan Markle. But what she finally revealed, the first cracks in the narrative, the moments of private conflict and contradiction, would shock even those who thought they knew the full story. Every narrative, no matter how carefully constructed, has moments where the facade begins to falter. For Meghan Markle, the first cracks in her carefully curated public story emerged in July 2020, during the period surrounding her miscarriage. While the op-ed presented a linear, heart-wrenching tale of loss and vulnerability, Doria Ragland's observations reveal that the reality behind the scenes was far more complex. And, in some cases, contradictory to the public narrative. These first cracks, subtle as they may have seemed at the time, would later grow into a pattern that fundamentally challenged the story the world believed. The public saw Meghan as open, honest, and emotionally transparent. She shared grief in a way that felt universally relatable. Social media responded with an outpouring of sympathy. Friends, celebrities, and everyday people alike wrote messages of support, sharing their own stories of loss and expressing solidarity. The narrative was clear. Meghan had suffered, Meghan was brave, and Meghan was truthful. But Doria Ragland observed nuances that the public never saw. There were moments of private reflection, of emotional tension, and of discrepancies between what was said publicly and what unfolded behind closed doors. These nuances created the first real cracks in the story. A divergence between perception and reality that would later become significant in understanding the full scope of events. One of the most telling aspects, according to Doria, was timing. The public assumed that the miscarriage occurred and was immediately processed as a private tragedy. Yet, behind the scenes, there were conversations, medical consultations, and emotional responses that unfolded over time, not all of which aligned neatly with the narrative presented in the op-ed. These details may seem minor, but in the broader context of public storytelling, timing is everything. The way events are framed, the order in which they are presented, and the emotional emphasis placed on particular moments all shape public perception. Doria noted that these subtleties were omitted or altered in the public version, creating a version of events that was emotionally compelling but not fully accurate. Another crack appeared in the form of interpersonal dynamics. According to sources close to Doria, there were tensions between Meghan and certain members of her inner circle regarding how the miscarriage should be addressed publicly. Friends and advisors offered varying guidance, some urging privacy, others encouraging openness. Meghan's decisions about how to present her experience were influenced by multiple perspectives, not simply the raw emotion of grief. From Doria's vantage point, this interplay of advice, strategy, and emotion was a critical element missing from the op-ed. It was not merely a story of personal loss. It was a story shaped by multiple voices, perspectives, and strategic considerations. The emotional cracks are equally significant. While the op-ed presents grief in a linear, almost poetic way, Doria witnessed moments of anger, frustration, and vulnerability that were never conveyed publicly. These emotions were not contradictory to the experience of loss. They were part of it, but they complicate the narrative presented to the public. Grief is rarely neat. It is messy, contradictory, and often intertwined with other emotions such as guilt, fear, and even strategic calculation when under intense public scrutiny. Doria's insight highlights the fact that the public story simplified a far more complex emotional landscape, creating the first cracks in what had appeared to be a seamless narrative of vulnerability and honesty. Media coverage also contributed to these cracks. Headlines amplified emotional beats, emphasized certain phrases, and often omitted context that would have presented a more nuanced picture. The narrative quickly took on a life of its own, moving beyond Meghan's control and shaping public perception in ways that reinforced the crafted story. Doria observed how the interplay between Meghan's narrative choices and media framing created gaps between the lived reality and the public story. These gaps were subtle at first, small discrepancies that most people would not notice, but they were significant because they laid the groundwork for larger questions and later revelations. Another critical crack involved the perception of intent. The op-ed portrayed Meghan as entirely reactive, grieving, vulnerable, and emotionally raw. However, according to Doria, there were moments where Meghan demonstrated a level of strategic awareness about how her story would be received. This is not to suggest manipulation in a malicious sense, but rather an acute awareness of public perception and the potential impact of her words. Grief and strategic thinking are not mutually exclusive, yet the public narrative framed Meghan as solely emotional, creating a partial picture that omitted this layer of complexity. Doria's insight reveals that the story of July 2020 was multidimensional, encompassing both personal loss and calculated public storytelling. These cracks are the first indicators that the narrative surrounding Meghan Markle was not entirely linear or transparent. They reveal a tension between the private experience of grief and the public construction of a compelling narrative. They highlight the interplay between emotional reality and strategic communication, between lived experience and crafted perception. And they set the stage for the broader revelations that Doria would later provide. Truths that challenge the version of events millions around the world have accepted as fact. What makes this first crack particularly compelling is its subtlety. At the time, The public was largely unaware that any discrepancy existed. Meghan's op-ed was widely praised, widely shared, and widely empathized with. Few questioned the narrative, and even fewer considered that there might be nuances or contradictions lurking beneath the surface. Yet Doria, as the mother and intimate observer, recognized these cracks immediately. She saw the gaps between the story told and the reality experienced, the tension between emotion and strategy, and the divergence between public perception and private truth. Doria's perspective underscores a critical lesson. The story we see in public is rarely the full story. Headlines, op-eds, and social media narratives capture fragments of reality, emphasizing the emotionally resonant while often omitting complexity, nuance, or inconvenient truths. In Meghan Markle's case, the first cracks revealed that the public story, powerful as it was, did not fully reflect the private reality. These cracks are not evidence that Meghan's grief was false. Rather, they indicate that the narrative was curated, shaped, and partially simplified for consumption by millions who would respond emotionally, but not necessarily critically, to the story. As we move forward, it becomes clear that these first cracks are only the beginning. They hint at a broader pattern, a series of inconsistencies and contradictions that, when viewed together, suggest a narrative more complex than the world realized. Doria Ragland's revelations provide insight into this complexity, shedding light on the private reality behind the public narrative and challenging assumptions that have been widely accepted for years. And what comes next? The deeper cracks, the contradictions, and the private moments of tension that no one outside the family ever saw will reveal just how far the divergence between perception and reality extends. The world may have believed one story, but the truth, as Doria shows, is far more intricate and far more shocking than anyone imagined. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Grief is never a simple thing. It is messy, unpredictable, and deeply personal. For most people, it exists entirely in private, a series of intimate moments, reflections, and emotional waves that only those closest to the grieving person experience. But for Meghan Markle, grief in July 2020 was a public affair. Her miscarriage became not just a personal tragedy, but a story consumed by millions around the world. Social media, news outlets, and global audiences watched, commented, and judged. And in the midst of this unprecedented scrutiny, the tension between Meghan's private grief and the public narrative became one of the most critical dynamics of her story. From the very beginning, Meghan's op-ed framed the miscarriage in deeply emotional, accessible terms. She described her loss with a vulnerability that resonated widely. The shock, the emptiness, the heartbreak. Millions empathized, sharing their own experiences of loss and expressing solidarity. The essay became a symbol of courage and honesty, portraying Meghan as a woman willing to expose her most intimate sorrow to the world. And yet, according to Doria Ragland, the essay captured only part of the truth. Behind the polished prose and carefully structured narrative lay a private reality that was more complex, more nuanced, and sometimes in tension with the story presented to the public. Doria observed the private grief in ways that no one outside the family could. She witnessed her daughter's moments of raw emotion, the tears, the private conversations, the quiet moments of despair that were never photographed or recorded. She saw grief expressed not only through sadness, but also through frustration, anger, and the subtle anxiety that accompanies loss under constant scrutiny. These private emotional layers were largely absent from the public account, which emphasized a linear, almost literary progression from pain to reflection to resilience. In Doria's eyes, the op-ed's simplification of the emotional experience created a narrative that was compelling but not fully accurate. This tension between private grief and public narrative is not unique to Meghan. Public figures often experience the same dynamic. Personal experiences are filtered, curated, and presented in ways that maximize empathy, relatability, or impact. The difference in Meghan's case, however, is the magnitude of scrutiny. She was not just a celebrity. She was a duchess, a member of one of the most scrutinized families in the world. Every word, expression, and public statement was dissected, analyzed, and amplified. The stakes of public narrative were extraordinarily high, making the divergence between private emotion and public storytelling even more pronounced. One of the most striking examples, as Doria later revealed, involved the timing and framing of public disclosure. The op-ed appeared 4 months after the miscarriage, a delay that allowed Meghan and her advisors to structure the narrative, select emotional beats, and determine the impact of each word. In private, the grief unfolded in real time, messy, contradictory, and emotionally complex. In public, however, it was transformed into a story that emphasized vulnerability, resilience, and moral authority. The tension between these two realities, the lived, messy grief and the curated, emotionally potent public narrative, reveals the first major fault line between perception and reality. Doria also observed how external pressures influenced the public narrative. Friends, advisors, and the media all played a role, consciously or unconsciously, in shaping the story. Some encouraged openness, framing the essay as a means to connect with a global audience. Others recommended caution, highlighting the risk of oversharing in a world that can be unforgiving. Meghan navigated these conflicting inputs while simultaneously processing deeply personal loss. According to Doria, these competing pressures shaped decisions about what to include, what to omit, and how to frame emotional experiences in a way that would resonate without causing unintended backlash. The contrast between private grief and public narrative extended to interactions with family members and insiders. In private, Meghan could express anger, frustration, and vulnerability freely. In public, these emotions were largely filtered or softened, contributing to a cohesive narrative that emphasized courage and composure. Doria's unique perspective allows us to see both sides of this dynamic. The authentic, unfiltered sorrow of a mother mourning alongside her daughter, and the calculated, polished presentation designed for public consumption. The divergence between these realities is where the first cracks deepen, revealing complexities the global audience could not perceive. Another critical element is the psychological toll of performing grief publicly. For most people, grieving is an internal process. It does not require constant observation or external validation. For Meghan, however, grief became performative by necessity. The act of sharing private loss with millions created a pressure to maintain authenticity while simultaneously controlling perception. Doria observed the strain this placed on her daughter, the emotional exhaustion, the careful modulation of tone and expression, and the constant awareness of how every disclosure would be interpreted. This performative aspect of grief is largely invisible to the public, yet it fundamentally shaped how July 2020 was experienced internally versus how it was perceived externally. Media amplification further complicated the dynamic. Headlines focused on emotional peaks, social media commentary framed the narrative through collective empathy, and journalists emphasized quotes that reinforced the image of Meghan as courageous and vulnerable. Each amplification removed layers of nuance, flattening the complexity of private experience into a digestible, emotionally resonant story. Doria observed how this process both protected and constrained her daughter. It amplified empathy, but obscured truth. The tension between amplification and authenticity is central to understanding the divergence between private grief and public narrative. Finally, Doria's insights highlight the human cost of this tension. Grieving under global scrutiny is not simply emotionally taxing. It is psychologically complex, socially challenging, and morally fraught. Meghan had to balance personal sorrow with public expectation, emotional honesty with strategic framing, and intimate vulnerability with global performance. These dual pressures created a dynamic in which private grief and public narrative existed in constant negotiation, sometimes aligning but often diverging. Doria's perspective reveals not only the emotional reality of July 2020, but also the structural forces, media, advisors, public perception, that shaped the way grief was performed, interpreted, and consumed. As we continue, the critical question emerges. What happens when the tension between private grief and public narrative becomes too great to ignore? When the world believes one story, but the private reality tells another? Doria Ragland's observations suggest that this tension is at the heart of the July 2020 miscarriage story, illuminating discrepancies, contradictions, and emotional nuances that have remained hidden from the public. And as the story unfolds, these revelations will challenge long-held assumptions about Meghan Markle, her experiences, and the narratives that define her public persona. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The private truths of grief, when juxtaposed against the public narrative, began to create consequences and revelations that would ripple far beyond personal loss, reshaping perception, relationships, and legacy. When Meghan Markle's story of loss went public, the world watched. Headlines blared, social media erupted, and international news outlets dissected every word. The global reaction was immediate and intense, an outpouring of empathy, speculation, and commentary. But behind the headlines, there was a powerful mechanism at work: media amplification. What the public experienced was not simply Meghan's story. It was a curated version magnified, reframed, and interpreted through layers of media filters, each one shaping perception in subtle yet profound ways. Media amplification works by taking a narrative and magnifying its most emotionally resonant elements. In Meghan's case, her grief, vulnerability, and resilience were highlighted, creating a story that was instantly relatable and emotionally compelling. Phrases like heartbreaking loss and courage in grief became the focal points for headlines, social media posts, and news commentary. While these elements were authentic parts of her experience, their repetition and framing emphasized a particular version of events. A version that aligned with public expectations of a royal tragedy told through a modern, empathetic lens. Doria Ragland observed the effects of this amplification firsthand. She noticed how the story of Meghan's miscarriage, when filtered through media outlets, became larger than the personal reality. Moments of private reflection were transformed into symbolic gestures of resilience. Subtle emotional nuances were simplified into digestible sound bites. For Doria, the amplification highlighted both the power and the peril of public storytelling. On one hand, it allowed Meghan's experience to resonate with millions, raising awareness of miscarriage and emotional grief. On the other hand, it risked overshadowing the complexities, contradictions, and private truths that define the actual events of July 2020. The amplification did not stop with the narrative itself. It extended to public perception. Social media, in particular, played a critical role in shaping collective understanding. Tweets, posts, and viral threads distilled Meghan's story into emotive symbols, hashtags, and viral commentary. Supporters celebrated her courage. Critics questioned motives, timing, and accuracy.